If she's been stealing from me, I'll know tonight." Richard Coleman didn't raise his voice when he said it, but the words settled in his chest like cold metal, heavy and certain, as he stood in the dim glow of his office, fingers resting on the edge of a half-open safe that should have been untouched, the soft click of the lock still echoing faintly in the silence. Because nothing in his house moved without his permission, nothing slipped past his systems, not the staff, not the schedules, not even the quiet woman who cleaned his floors like she was trying to disappear into them. And yet tonight, for the third time this week, Ava Johnson had left early. No request, no explanation, just a quiet nod to the house manager and a quick exit through the service door. And that was what didn't fit, because Ava was predictable, invisible, almost mechanical in her routine, the kind of employee who never drew attention, never asked for anything, never even made eye contact unless spoken to. But Richard had learned long ago that the quiet ones were the ones who broke patterns, and patterns were everything. He checked his watch, 7:42 p.m., and moved through the hallway with measured steps, the polished hardwood reflecting the low amber lights like a mirror of control. Outside, the air carried a faint chill, early fall settling over the city, and he saw her across the street, already walking fast, shoulders slightly hunched, a worn jacket pulled tight around her frame. Not toward the bus stop closest to the estate, but further down, past it. Like she didn't want to be seen leaving from his world, Richard paused for half a second, then followed, keeping distance. His car left behind on purpose, because this wasn't about speed, it was about truth. Ava didn't look back once. Not when she crossed under the flickering street lamp, not when she stepped onto the crowded bus, not even when the doors hissed shut behind her. And Richard stood there for a moment, watching the bus pull away, something unfamiliar stirring beneath his usual certainty, not doubt, not yet, but attention, like a crack forming in glass you hadn't realized was fragile. 10 minutes later, he was in a cab, eyes fixed ahead, replaying every detail, the missing bills, the early exits, the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was looking. And he had noticed. Of course he had. He noticed everything. But he had dismissed it as exhaustion or weakness, neither of which interested him. Until now. The city changed as they drove, glass towers giving way to older buildings, neon signs flickering above narrow streets, sidewalks more crowded, more alive, more chaotic than the controlled silence of his estate. And when the cab finally slowed, Ava was already stepping off the bus ahead, her pace quickening, heading toward a building washed in harsh fluorescent light, the kind that flattened everything it touched. And Richard felt his jaw tighten as he read the sign above the entrance. A hospital. Worn, overcrowded, nothing like the private facilities he funded but never visited. Ava didn't hesitate. She pushed through the doors and disappeared inside, and Richard stood across the street, watching the automatic doors slide shut behind her, the reflection of his own figure faint in the glass. Perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, completely out of place, and for the first time that night, his certainty shifted, just slightly, enough to let a single thought slip through. Quiet but unignorable. What exactly are you doing here, Ava Johnson? The automatic doors whispered shut behind Ava, sealing her into a world that felt nothing like the one she had just left, and Richard waited exactly 5 seconds before crossing the street, each step slower now, more deliberate, as if the ground itself demanded permission he was not used to asking for. The fluorescent lights inside washed over him the moment he entered, too bright, too cold, flattening every shadow and exposing every detail he would normally ignore. The air carried the faint scent of antiseptic and something else, something heavier, something human, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately define. Because this was not a place built for control or efficiency or profit. It was a place where things broke and people waited, and waiting was something Richard Coleman had spent his entire life avoiding. He adjusted his cuff out of habit, a small motion of control, and scanned the room. Ava was already at the front desk, speaking softly to a nurse, her posture smaller than usual, almost fragile, one hand gripping the strap of her worn bag, the other sliding an envelope across the counter with a hesitation that did not belong. To someone who was used to giving anything away, Richard moved to the side, staying just far enough to remain unseen, his reflection briefly catching in a glass panel, sharp suit, polished shoes, a man who did not belong in places like this. And yet there he was, watching his employee like a stranger. The nurse opened the envelope and her expression shifted, not dramatically, just a subtle softening around the eyes. The kind of look people gave when they saw something that mattered. Ava leaned in slightly, her voice too low for him to catch the words. But her shoulders told the story, tense, hopeful, carrying something far heavier than the bag on her arm. The nurse nodded once, then twice, typing something into the computer, and Ava exhaled, just barely, as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Richard felt his jaw tighten again, the image aligning too easily with the numbers he had seen earlier, the missing cash, the unexplained withdrawals, the pattern forming in a way that made sense, too much sense. And yet something about it refused to settle cleanly in his mind, because there was no urgency in her movements, no fear of being caught, only a quiet determination, the kind he had seen in people negotiating contracts, not in someone handing over money they could not afford to lose. Ava turned away from the desk and moved quickly down the hallway, past rows of plastic chairs filled with people who looked like they had been waiting longer than time itself, some staring at the floor, others at nothing at all. And Richard followed at a distance, his steps softer now, his usual confidence replaced by something more cautious, almost reluctant. She stopped outside a door marked with a number that meant nothing to him, but everything to her. He could see it in the way her hand paused just before touching the handle, like she was bracing herself for something inside. Then she opened it and disappeared again, the door swinging shut behind her with a quiet finality. Richard stood there, just outside, close enough now to hear the faint hum of machines, the low murmur of voices, and something else, something that made him stop completely. A small voice, thin but clear, carrying through the gap before the door fully closed, a child's voice, and it did not sound afraid. It sounded tired, the kind of tired that did not belong to someone so young. Richard remained still, his hand hovering near the door, but not touching it, as if crossing that threshold would mean stepping into something he was not prepared to understand. And for the first time since he left his house, the question shifted, no longer sharp with suspicion, but heavier, quieter. What had he not seen all this time? The door did not close completely, leaving a narrow gap where light spilled into the hallway, and Richard found himself standing there longer than he intended, his breath slower now, quieter, as if even the sound of it might disturb whatever existed on the other side. And through that small opening, the world shifted again, not in a dramatic way, but in something softer, something harder to ignore. Ava sat beside a hospital bed that looked too large for the small figure resting in it, her posture no longer guarded or withdrawn, but open, leaning forward, one hand gently wrapped around the child's fingers, her thumb moving in slow, steady circles like she was grounding both of them at once. The boy could not have been older than 8, his face pale under the harsh lighting, but his eyes were focused entirely on her, as if she was the only thing in the room that made sense. "You came back," he said, his voice quiet but certain, and Ava smiled, not the polite, almost invisible smile she wore in the mansion, but something real, something warm. "I always come back," she replied, her voice softer than Richard had ever heard it, carrying a kind of strength that did not need to be loud to be felt. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small paper container, the kind you would get from a diner, and carefully opened it. The faint smell of something simple, something warm, drifted into the hallway. "They said you need to eat a little more today," she added gently. And the boy made a small face, not refusing, just tired. "Did you eat?" he asked, and the question landed in the room with a weight that did not belong to a child. Ava paused for just a fraction of a second, so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not watching closely. But Richard saw it, the way her hand stilled, the way her eyes shifted just slightly before she answered. "Of course I did," she said, with a lightness that felt practiced, and the boy studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting it, trusting her without question, and that trust filled the room more than any machine or monitor ever could. Ava picked up a spoon and carefully fed him, one small bite at a time, patient, unhurried, as if there was nowhere else she needed to be, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of that moment. And Richard felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, not the sharp irritation he knew well, not the cold calculation he relied on, but something heavier, something that did not resolve into a clear conclusion, because this did not look like theft. It did not look like deception. It looked like something else entirely, something he had not accounted for. The boy's hand tightened slightly around hers. "You are not going to leave, right?" he asked, his voice quieter. Now, almost afraid of the answer, and Ava leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his. "Not tonight," she said softly. "I am right here." And the room seemed to settle around those words, the tension easing in a way that could not be measured or quantified. Richard stepped back instinctively, the hallway suddenly feeling too narrow, too close, his mind moving quickly, trying to reconstruct what he thought he knew. The missing money, the late hours, the silence, all of it rearranging itself into a pattern he had not considered, one that did not fit neatly into right or wrong. And as he stood there, just outside that door, he realized that for the first time since this began, he was no longer certain of anything at all. Richard did not leave, even though every instinct built over decades of control told him to step away, to return to the world where everything made sense. But instead he remained in that narrow hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights pressing down on him, the distant sound of rolling carts and quiet voices blending into a rhythm that felt foreign and unstructured. And he found himself watching the door again, not out of suspicion now, but out of something closer to uncertainty, the kind that did not come with clear answers. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time moved differently here, stretched and softened by the quiet persistence of people who had no choice but to wait. And when the door finally opened, Ava stepped out slowly, careful not to make noise, her movements deliberate, as if she was protecting the fragile calm she had just left behind. She did not see him at first, her eyes lowered, her shoulders slightly slumped now, the strength she held inside that room giving way to something heavier, something that looked a lot like exhaustion. She walked a few steps down the hall and stopped near a vending machine, the bright glow of its display casting a pale light across her face. And for a moment she just stood there, not reaching for anything, not moving, just breathing, like she was trying to gather herself before taking the next step. Richard stayed where he was, half-shadowed by the corner, watching, and then he saw it, the small shift in her expression, the way her hand moved to her pocket and paused, fingers brushing against something that was not there, or maybe something that had already been given away. She let out a slow breath and turned away from the machine without buying anything, her hand dropping back to her side, empty, and something about that small moment settled deeper into Richard than anything he had seen so far. Because it was not dramatic, it was not loud, it was simply real, and it did not fit into any calculation he had ever made. A nurse approached her then, speaking softly, and Ava straightened slightly, nodding as she listened. "We received the payment," the nurse said, her voice gentle but direct. "It will cover this week, but after that we will need to discuss the next steps." Ava nodded again, her lips pressing together briefly before she answered. "I understand," her voice steady. Even now, even here, and Richard felt the words land heavier than they should have, because they carried something final in them, something that suggested a line she was already approaching. The nurse hesitated, then added, "You should take care of yourself too," and Ava gave a small, almost automatic smile, the kind people used when they did not want to explain anything further. "I am fine," she said, and Richard knew immediately that it was not true, not because of the words, but because of the way she said them, too quickly, too practiced. The nurse gave her a look that held more understanding than judgment, then nodded and walked away, leaving Ava alone again in the harsh light. And for a moment she did not move, her gaze drifting back toward the room she had just left, her shoulders lifting slightly with a quiet inhale, then falling again as she exhaled. And Richard realized that everything he had assumed about her, every quiet conclusion he had drawn from a distance, had been built on what he had chosen not to see. And now that he was seeing it, really seeing it, the structure of those assumptions was beginning to crack, not all at once, but enough to make him question where the truth actually began. Because this was not a story about missing money anymore. It was something else entirely, something he had never had to understand before. And as Ava turned and started walking toward the exit, her steps slower now, more deliberate, Richard found himself stepping forward without thinking, not to stop her, not yet, but because for the first time, walking away felt harder than staying. Richard stopped just short of calling her name, the word forming in his throat but never leaving his lips, because something told him that if he broke this moment too soon, he would lose whatever fragile understanding had begun to take shape. So instead he followed again, quieter now, no longer driven by suspicion, but by a need he could not quite define. Ava pushed through the hospital doors and stepped back into the cool night air. The city humming faintly around her, distant traffic, a flicker of neon, the soft rustle of wind against the buildings, and for a second she just stood there on the sidewalk, eyes closed, as if the outside world required an adjustment, like she had to relearn how to breathe in a place that did not hold the same weight as the room she had just left. Richard remained a few steps behind, watching, his presence still hidden but no longer detached, because now every movement she made carried meaning. Every pause, every breath, and Ava reached into her bag again, pulling it open wider this time, searching, her fingers moving through its contents with increasing urgency, until she stopped, her hand resting at the bottom, empty, and the realization settled over her face slowly, not shock, not panic, just a quiet acceptance, like she had already known this moment would come. She closed the bag gently, almost carefully, as if even the act of closing it required respect for what was no longer inside. And then she turned, not toward the bus stop she had used earlier, but in the opposite direction, walking past it without hesitation, her pace steady but slower now, measured in a way that suggested she was conserving something, energy, strength, maybe both. Richard followed again, the distance between them unchanged, but the distance in his understanding shrinking with every step. They walked several blocks, the city gradually shifting again, storefronts closing, lights dimming, the crowd thinning until it was just the two of them moving through a quieter stretch of street. And then Ava stopped in front of a small convenience store, the kind that stayed open late, its windows bright against the darkness. She stood there for a moment, looking inside, her gaze lingering on the shelves, the refrigerated section, the simple things that most people would not think twice about. And Richard felt something tighten again as she did not move forward, did not reach for the door. Instead she stepped back, just slightly, and then turned away, continuing down the street without going in. And it was in that moment that the last piece of his assumption began to fall apart. Because this was not someone taking more than they needed, this was someone who had already given more than they could afford. Ava's steps slowed further as she reached a bench near a bus stop, finally sitting down, her shoulders lowering as if the weight she carried had nowhere else to go. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees, her hands loosely clasped, and for the first time since he had started following her, she looked small, not invisible, not quiet, but simply human. And Richard stood across the street, no longer hiding, no longer trying to remain unseen, just watching, the distance between them now filled with something he could not ignore, something that had nothing to do with money or rules or systems. The night air moved gently around them, carrying the faint sound of an approaching bus in the distance. But Ava did not look up, did not move, and Richard realized that whatever line he had believed existed between his world and hers had already been crossed, not by her, but by him. And there was no way to step back without pretending he had not seen any of this, without choosing ignorance over truth. And that was something he was no longer sure he could do. The bus pulled up with a low mechanical sigh, its headlights washing over Ava in a pale glow that made her look even more fragile against the dark. But she did not move, not immediately. The doors opened with a sharp hiss, and a few passengers stepped off, their footsteps quick, purposeful, disappearing into the night without looking back, and still she remained seated, her hands loosely clasped, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the street in front of her, as if she was measuring something invisible, something heavier than distance or time. Richard watched from across the street, the sound of the bus engine idling filling the silence between them. And for a brief moment he expected her to stand, to gather herself and move forward the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, without hesitation, but she did not. And when the driver glanced toward her and then back to the empty sidewalk, the doors finally closed again, the bus pulling away and leaving behind only the fading hum of its engine and the soft echo of what she had just let pass. Ava exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction more, and she leaned back against the bench, tilting her head slightly upward, eyes closing for a second, as if she was borrowing a moment of stillness before the next decision. The streetlight above flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft amber circle around her. And Richard felt the weight of that stillness settle into him, heavier than anything he had seen inside the hospital, because this was not about crisis or urgency. This was the quiet aftermath, the space where choices became real. He crossed the street then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a steady walk that felt unfamiliar in its lack of purpose, each step bringing him closer to a line he had never crossed before. And when he stopped a few feet from the bench, Ava opened her eyes, sensing the presence before she fully saw it, her gaze lifting slowly until it met his. And for a moment neither of them spoke. The city noise distant now, reduced to a faint backdrop that did not matter. Her expression did not shift into surprise or fear, only a quiet recognition, as if she had always known that this moment might come. Richard stood there, his usual certainty absent, replaced by something far more uncertain, far more human. He looked at her, really looked, not as an employee, not as a problem to solve, but as a person whose story he had only just begun to understand, and the words he had prepared earlier. The accusations, the questions, the conclusions, none of them felt right anymore. They dissolved before they could take shape, leaving only the truth of what he had seen, the hospital room, the child's voice, the empty bag, the missed bus, all of it threading together into something he could not ignore. Ava spoke first, her voice calm, steady. "You followed me," she said, not accusing, not surprised, just stating what was already clear. Richard did not deny it. He did not try to explain it away. He simply nodded once, the motion small but honest, and for a moment that was enough. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything neither of them had said, the unspoken weight of what had been seen and what had yet to be understood. A cool breeze moved through the street, lifting a strand of Ava's hair before letting it fall back into place, and Richard found himself asking the one question that remained, not out of suspicion now, but out of something deeper, something that felt closer to concern than control. "Why did you not take the bus?" he asked quietly, and Ava's gaze shifted for a brief second, not away from him, but inward, as if she was choosing her answer carefully. And when she spoke, her voice carried no self-pity, no explanation meant to justify, only a simple truth. "Because I could not afford it tonight," she said, and the words landed between them with a quiet finality, more powerful than anything raised in anger, and Richard felt something inside him shift completely, not a crack this time, but a break, clean and undeniable, the kind that changed the shape of everything that came after. The words did not echo, they did not need to. They settled quietly between them, heavier than anything raised in anger, and Richard stood there, the night air cool against his skin, realizing that in all his years of building systems and structures and wealth measured in numbers too large to feel real, he had never once considered what it meant for someone to choose between a bus ride and a meal, between a few dollars and a moment of rest, because in his world those choices did not exist. They had been erased long ago by convenience, by access, by the assumption that everything could be solved if you simply paid for it. But Ava had just shown him something else entirely, something that did not bend to money the way he expected. She shifted slightly on the bench, not uncomfortable, not defensive, just steady, her hands still loosely clasped, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted the reality she had spoken out loud. And Richard found himself searching for something to say, something that would make sense of what he had just heard. But language felt insufficient, too structured, too clean for something that was neither. "You should have told me," he said finally, the words coming out quieter than he intended, and Ava's expression softened just slightly, not with relief, not with gratitude, but with understanding, the kind that did not require agreement. "It was not your responsibility," she replied, her voice even, and there was no bitterness in it, no accusation, only a simple boundary drawn without force, and that answer landed deeper than any protest could have, because it removed him from the center of the story, placed him not as the solution, but as an observer who had arrived too late to claim ownership of what had already been endured. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting for a moment toward the empty street, then back to her. "The money," he said, Not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a fragment of something he was trying to piece together. Ava did not look away. She did not hesitate. "It was not yours," she said, and now there was a subtle firmness in her tone, not defensive, but clear. "It was sitting there for months, labeled for charity distribution, untouched, unassigned. No one claimed it. No one moved it," she continued, her voice still calm. "I asked twice if it was being used. No one answered. So I did." And Richard felt the words land with a precision that mirrored his own thinking, because he knew exactly what she was referring to, the account he had approved and then forgotten, a fund created in a meeting he barely remembered, meant to be allocated later, managed by people he trusted to handle details he did not track. And in that moment the structure of his certainty shifted again, not breaking this time, but rearranging itself into something far more uncomfortable, because she was not wrong. She had not taken from him, not in the way he had assumed. She had taken from something that was meant to be given, something that had simply been left idle and used, invisible, just like she had been in his house. Ava watched him as he processed this, her expression unchanged, patient in a way that did not rush him toward understanding. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt the absence of control settle in fully, not as a threat, but as a truth. "You made a decision that was not yours to make," he said. The words quieter now, less certain, and Ava nodded once, acknowledging it without resistance. "Yes," she said, "I did." And then she added, after a brief pause, "Because someone had to." And there it was, not defiance, not justification, just a statement that existed without apology, and Richard realized that this was the part he had never accounted for, the space where rules and reality did not align, where systems designed for order failed to meet the urgency of something human, something immediate. The image of the boy in the hospital bed returned to him, the way his hand had held onto hers, the way he had asked if she had eaten, and suddenly the question of ownership, of permission, of policy, all of it felt smaller, less defined. Ava stood slowly from the bench, not in a hurry, not trying to leave the conversation, but simply continuing forward, the way she always had, step by step, without waiting for anything to change. And Richard watched her, understanding now that what he had witnessed was not a single moment, not a single choice, but a pattern of decisions made quietly, repeatedly, without recognition, without support. And as she began to walk again, he spoke once more, his voice carrying something new, something stripped of assumption. "Does he have a name?" he asked, and Ava paused just briefly before answering. "Ethan," she said, and then she kept walking, the sound of her footsteps soft against the pavement, steady, certain, and Richard remained where he was for a moment longer, the night stretching around him, the city unchanged, but something inside him undeniably different, because for the first time, he was no longer looking at a problem to solve. He was looking at a truth he could not ignore. Richard did not call after her this time. He did not try to stop her or offer anything that would interrupt the quiet momentum of her steps. Instead, he turned in the opposite direction, the movement deliberate, almost unfamiliar, as if he was choosing something without fully understanding it yet. The city stretched ahead of him in long lines of light and shadow, but his focus had narrowed, sharpened by a single name that now carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed. Ethan. The sound of it stayed with him as he walked, not fading, not dissolving into the background like most things did. And by the time he reached his car, the silence inside it felt different, no longer a space of control, but a space filled with questions that refused to settle. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, the dashboard lights casting a soft glow across his face. And then he reached for his phone, not out of habit, but with intention, the kind that came slowly. Built from something deeper than routine, he dialed a number he rarely used directly. And when the voice on the other end answered, sharp, efficient, ready for instruction, Richard spoke without hesitation, his tone calm, but unmistakably firm. "I need a full audit of the Coleman Foundation accounts," he said. "Every allocation, every delay, every unassigned fund from the past 12 months. There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. "Tonight?" the voice asked, and Richard's gaze shifted toward the dark street outside. "Now," he replied, and ended the call before any further questions could follow. The engine started with a low hum, But he did not drive home. Not yet. Instead, he turned the car back toward the hospital, the route now familiar, each turn less uncertain than before, as if something inside him had already decided where he needed to be. The building came into view again, its harsh lights unchanged, its presence steady, and when he stepped inside once more, the atmosphere felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The same fluorescent glare, the same quiet tension in the air, but now it carried meaning, depth, something that reached beyond observation. He approached the front desk, the nurse from earlier looking up as he did, her expression neutral at first, then slightly curious as she took in his appearance, his presence. "Can I help you?" she asked, and Richard held her gaze, not with authority, but with clarity. "The child in room 12, he said. "Ethan," and the name did not feel foreign anymore. "I would like to know what he needs." The nurse studied him for a moment, measuring something unspoken. Then her posture shifted, just slightly. "Are you family?" she asked, and Richard paused, the question simple, but the answer not, because in every sense that mattered to forms and systems and records, he was not, and yet the truth felt more complicated than that. "No," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I am here to help." The nurse held his gaze a second longer, then nodded slowly, something in her expression softening. "Give me a moment," she said, turning to the computer, the soft clicking of keys filling the space between them, and Richard stood there, not impatient, not pushing, just waiting, something he was beginning to understand in a way he never had before. After a few seconds, she looked back at him. "He needs continued treatment, monitoring, medication, and stability," she said, her tone professional but not detached. "What he does not have is consistent coverage." Richard nodded once, the information settling into place with a clarity that felt almost stark. "Then that is what changes," he said quietly, not as a declaration, not as a promise meant to impress, but as a simple decision. The nurse blinked slightly, as if she had heard something unexpected. "We will need authorization, documentation," she began, but Richard was already reaching into his jacket, pulling out a card, placing it gently on the counter, not with force, not with urgency, just there, present. "You will have everything you need," he said, and there was no edge in his voice, no trace of the man who controlled rooms with presence alone, only certainty. The kind that came from understanding rather than assumption. The nurse looked down at the card, then back up at him, her expression shifting again, recognition this time, but also something else, something closer to respect. "I will contact administration," she said, and Richard nodded, stepping back slightly, giving her space, because this was no longer about control, it was about follow-through. And as he stood there, the sounds of the hospital moving around him, he realized that nothing he had done that night felt like a transaction. Nothing felt like something to be recorded or measured. It felt like a correction, quiet, necessary, long overdue. And somewhere down the hall, behind a closed door, a child named Ethan slept, unaware that the world outside his room had shifted in a way that might finally allow him to rest without question, without uncertainty, and Richard remained there, not rushing, not leaving, simply present in a place he would have never chosen before, understanding now that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones no one saw being made. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of light that slipped through hospital windows without asking for attention, soft and pale, stretching across the polished floors and settling gently against closed doors. And in room 12, the steady rhythm of monitored breathing remained unchanged, a quiet assurance that something fragile had held through the night. Ava stepped into the hallway just after sunrise, her movements slower than usual, the weight of the previous day still present in the way she carried herself. But there was something else too, something subtle, something she could not yet name. She approached the front desk with the same quiet determination she always carried, ready to ask the same questions, ready to face the same answers. But before she could speak, the nurse looked up and smiled, not the polite kind, but something warmer, something that reached her eyes. "Good morning," she said, and Ava paused, sensing the shift before hearing it. "We have an update for you." The nurse continued, turning the screen slightly, and Ava stepped closer, her gaze scanning the words that did not make sense at first, not because they were unclear, but because they were unexpected. the balance that had been hanging over everything, the uncertainty that had shaped every decision. It was gone, replaced by a single line that read, "Fully covered, authorized, confirmed." Ava blinked once, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. But they did not. They remained exactly as they were, steady, certain, real. "There must be a mistake," she said quietly, her voice not disbelieving, just careful, and the nurse shook her head gently. "No mistake," she replied. "Everything has been approved, treatment, medication, continued care, all of it." And Ava felt something shift inside her, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to make her breath catch for a moment. Because she had learned not to expect this, not to rely on something she could not control, and yet here it was, placed in front of her without explanation, without warning. "Who did this?" she asked, the question soft, almost hesitant, and the nurse glanced briefly toward the hallway, then back at her. "Someone who did not want recognition," she said simply, and Ava stood there, the answer settling in a space that did not require more detail, because somehow, without needing to see it, without needing to hear it spoken aloud, she understood, not completely, not in every detail, but enough. She nodded once, a small motion, then turned toward the hallway, her steps lighter now, not because everything had changed, but because something had. And inside the room, Ethan stirred slightly, his eyes opening slowly as she approached, and when he saw her, the same quiet certainty returned to his expression. "You came back," he said, his voice still soft, still tired, but carrying something new, something steadier. Ava smiled, the warmth in it deeper now, reaching beyond the moment. "I told you I would," she replied, taking his hand again, the simple contact grounding them both. And outside, down the length of the corridor, Richard stood near the window, the morning light catching against the glass, reflecting his outline back at him. But he was not looking at himself. He was looking through it, toward something beyond, something he had not seen before. His hands rested at his sides, no phone, no movement, just stillness. And when Ava stepped into the hallway again, their eyes met for a brief second, no words exchanged, none needed, because everything that mattered had already been understood. She gave a small nod, not as thanks, not as acknowledgement, but as something quieter, something shared, and then she turned back toward the room, the door closing softly behind her, and Richard remained where he was, the silence around him no longer empty, but full, carrying the weight of a decision that had changed more than one life. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to measure it, to define it, or to control it. He simply stood there, letting the light settle, letting the moment exist exactly as it was, complete in its quiet.